So, Rav Yonatan, you touched on something very important. That's what I want to deal with in this talk, which is, a lot of people ask when they're reading Agada, did these things historically happen? Are they just metaphorical, symbolic, or are they actually historical accounts? And obviously you could ask this question about the Torah as well, but let's just make it focused on the Agada today. I think the Rambam is a great place to start. The Rambam talks a lot about in his Hakdama, his introduction to the Shemona Prakim, that he believes very sincerely that the main purpose of the Agada is philosophical and spiritual concepts. In other words, for him, it's not that he's saying it isn't about history, it's not that it didn't happen, but in no way is that the purpose of why it was written down. And the Rambam has a very, very strong opinion about people who think it is supposed to just be a historical thing. He thinks they've missed the total point, and he is mizalzel. He really puts down these thinkers. Now, we don't have to go that far to insult people who think of it like that, but I think why the Rambam bothered him so much is because the Rambam has a certain sense of respect for the Torah, and for him, the Torah is only powerful, it's only the word of God if it's coming to teach us in our own lives. So when he reads stories in the Talmud, and we all know the Rambam went through the whole of Shas, the whole of the Talmud, he codified it, he made it in order with laws. So obviously he was going through the stories at the same time. And while he's reading these stories, he's thinking, well, what do these stories come to teach me? And in More Nevuchim, the guy from Perplexed, he tries to uncover some of the meanings of them. So Rav Yonatan, maybe I could ask you, have you ever come across a time where you were reading Agada and you felt in tension, you felt like a struggle, like, did this really happen like this? Is it just metaphorical? And how did you resolve, or how did you live with that struggle?
I'm trying to think of a specific example. Not one's coming to mind right now, but the way that I've approached a lot of Agada is through the lens of our great sages who have themselves engrossed themselves in it, specifically the Maharal, some of Ev Kook, the Maharsha in the back of the Gemara. There aren't a huge number of Mefarshim that have really delved into that. Maybe that's something that we in our generation can start to write, to put that in the right direction. But my general sense is that these great sages had a sense, because they understood how to unlock the keys of this text, what was to be taken literally, what was not to be taken literally, what's allegorical, what's not, and where. But my sense is that the way that we walk in the world is just so different from them. I'll give you an example. The way that the Mishnah is codified as opposed to the way that the Rambam is codified, the Mishnah Torah is codified. The Mishnah is codified in a very experiential way. I mean, you open up, the Mishnah in Brachot, and it starts with the beginning of the day, which, according to the Jewish tradition, is night, right? So, every boker, the day starts at night. So obviously the first discussion in the oral tradition is going to be about the first mitzvah that comes upon us at nighttime, and so forth and so on. I think you see that through the rabbinic mind, the mind of Chazal, as opposed to, let's say, for the Rambam, for example, in the Mishnah Torah, the codifications of everything by topic. Now, for our mind, it's much easier to find something in the Rambam. If you have a specific question about something, you
more structured.
It's much more structured. But Chazal walked in the world in this beautiful way of experientially. It's almost, I think, unfortunately, hard for us to really touch. So, because if you walk in a world of experience, of trying to, again, like we said before, experience life, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, as we walk through it, and not as we look at it from external.
Not to be alienated from it.
So then we look at it in a different way. So the fact that these rabbis recorded stories, or the way that we read them in the Agada, and we're not sure whether it happened or not, or maybe even there's conflicting stories about the same person, that's not a problem for them. They're not concerned about historical inaccuracies per se. Not to say they're lying, but again, their purpose is
what is the
mahut of life,
and that's what they're going to put down on a page for us to read for all of time. Not what happened to me today, when I was going out, but what lesson did I learn from this interaction? So the way they tell it will obviously be different to if they were just telling a historical story. What's interesting is I was once teaching a class in Yeshiva Oraita. We were both teaching there many years back, which is a great institution. And I remember a student coming up to me after one class, and he said to me, we were discussing this idea of whether or not the Agada happened or not, and he had this really interesting thought. He said, what happens if in 100 years somebody was teaching a class of history, and they're teaching about the Holocaust. All these people were murdered in this horrific way, and people were put in ovens, and the teacher said, well, it's just symbolic. It's just a lesson to teach us about how bad life could get. But it didn't really happen. No one would really do that. And the student said to me, would that bother you? And I said, well, obviously it would bother me because it actually happened. So what's interesting about that thought is, well, I think it is powerful that it's based on a true story. In other words, I don't want the Holocaust just to be a metaphor for bad things that happened. When I tell it, it actually happened. Yeah, while I teach ideas, I'm going to refer the Holocaust and explain meaning from it and messages that relate to your life, but it is based on something very real that happened. So I think it's important while we read the Agadot together not to put too much emphasis on the symbolic, to say nothing happened, they totally made it up, because I think the greatness of a story is that it's based on something real, and from that real place that somebody went through, a message, an insight came out of. Another way to think about it is you go to a movie and you watch this incredible movie, and then somebody says to you, and well, do you know that's based on a true story? Now, why does that matter to us? It does matter to us. And I think one of the reasons why it matters is the idea takes on more power when it's not just a thought that came out of someone's mind, but something that they went through. And even if they play with the story a little bit, change one detail here, change one name here, the essence is captured from a very real place. And that, based on a true story feeling, I think is the way we should go about learning Agadot, that these Agadot are very much based on a true story, and that realness from where it came from should be conveyed through the message.
I appreciate the distinction. Thinking two things right now. First of all, my background beyond Jewish text study, before I got deeply into that world, was in the world of literature and fiction, and I have an undergrad degree and a master's degree in fiction. One of the things that one of my teachers shared with me is that, and I think there's a tremendous truth to this, is that fiction is sometimes truer than nonfiction. There's some things that can be told through the lens of something make-believe, so to speak, that gives us insights into the real in a way that the real can't. That's one side of it. The other side of it is, I agree with you. That's, for example, the Agadot around the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Obviously, there was, historically, I believe that there was a temple, and it stood there, and there were, during the Second Temple, there was the Romans that came in and destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, and we have teachings, not from Nevuah, that Eicha that tells us about this, and many Agadot that tell about the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash, the first and second temples. So if we look at those, maybe that's a good kind of test case. There are specific stories of towns that were destroyed by Titus and others, and the way that the temple was destroyed. But there are within those exaggerations, I guess we would call them, where the numbers seem to be quite inflated. So from one perspective, well, they are trying to get across the message that this was a calamity that is almost ungraspable. On another level, though, the point of the Agada is, again, to teach us the essence of it. So the numbers, maybe we'll talk about this as well, in Agada, everything is significant. It's ultimately, the symbolism is ultimately significant. So the numbers are significant, and the details that are chosen are significant. So, so maybe the question is, when we're choosing to tell a story, especially one of tragedy, what details are chosen? And how do we tell that story in order to get across that story in the way that we really want?
And I think that comes back to this thing that I want to reiterate before we start learning each Agada separately, is the main goal when learning Agada, definitely this is the Rambam's opinion, like you mentioned the Maharal, Rav Kook writes about this, Ben Ish Chai in his, is the spiritual meaning. What lesson can I learn? So as a spiritual religious text, because we're reading spiritual texts here, we're not just learning historical texts, I have to read it with spiritual and religious eyes. And if I don't have that type of genre in mind, it's a spiritual text, so then I get frustrated by questions that the person who wrote down the text is not at all trying to deal with. So it's very important to ask yourself, what genre am I going into? If I'm going into a movie and I expect a romantic comedy and it's a horror, I'm going to be disappointed or horrified. On the other hand, if I expect it to be a horror movie, so great, I expect those feelings. And so too, you go into a romantic movie, you're not going to be frustrated that there's no laughs if it's just romantic, because you expect that's the genre. So I would say so too when it comes to spiritual texts, and this is a very important thing in all of the Torah, but specifically what we're going to do with Agada is, as a spiritual religious text, the main goal whenever I open a page of Agada is to ask myself real questions, existential questions. What does this text help me connect to my soul, Hashem, God, and how I treat other people better?
Beautiful.